January 23, 1942. Freezing winds across Lamb Holm Island in the Orkney archipelago of Scotland. 550 Italian prisoners of war step off transport barges into a landscape so desolate it might as well be the surface of another planet. These men, captured during the grinding Western Desert Campaign in North Africa, have traveled from the scorching sands of Libya to this wind-swept rock where the North Sea meets the Atlantic, where winter daylight lasts barely 6 hours and the temperature rarely climbs above freezing. Major Thomas Pyres Buckland of the British Army watches through field glasses as the Italians are herded into the 13 corrugated steel Nissen huts that will serve as Camp 60, their new home for what could be years. The goal is utilitarian and blunt. Use these enemy prisoners to complete the Churchill Barriers, for massive concrete causeways designed to seal off the eastern approaches to Scapa Flow and prevent another disaster like the sinking of HMS Royal Oak. The backstory begins 3 years earlier in the pre-dawn darkness of October 14, 1939, when Captain Lieutenant Gunther Preen guided his Type 7B submarine U-47 through the treacherous currents of Kirk Sound, navigating between the hulks of deliberately sunk blockships that were supposed to seal this channel forever. At 1:04 a.m., German torpedoes struck the 30,450-ton battleship HMS Royal Oak as she lay at anchor in what the Royal Navy believed was an impregnable fortress harbor. The massive warship rolled to starboard and sank within 13 minutes, taking 835 officers and men to the bottom of Scapa Flow in one of the most audacious submarine raids in naval history. The psychological impact was devastating for Britain, a nation that had always counted on the Royal Navy as its shield against invasion, and the strategic implications were immediate and severe. Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, arrived in Orkney within weeks and ordered the construction of permanent barriers to block the 4 eastern entrances to Scapa Flow, a project that would require 250,000 tons of rock, 66,000 concrete blocks weighing 5 to 10 tons each, and a workforce that peaked at over 2,000 men working in conditions that would test human endurance to its limits. By early 1942, the construction company Balfour Beatty was facing a critical labor shortage as Britain's young men were being conscripted for combat duties across multiple theaters of war, and the harsh Orkney winter was driving civilian workers to demand transfers to more forgiving assignments. The solution came from an unexpected source: the prisoners of war streaming out of North Africa as British Commonwealth forces under General Sir Archibald Wavell and later General Bernard Montgomery systematically dismantled Italian resistance in the Western Desert. Operation Compass, launched in December 1940, had been one of the most lopsided military victories in modern history, with a British force of just 36,000 men capturing an astounding 133,298 Italian prisoners while suffering minimal casualties themselves. The Italian 10th Army, which had numbered over 150,000 troops in supposedly impregnable fortified camps around Sidi Barrani, Bardia, and Tobruk, collapsed like a house of cards when faced with superior British tactics, equipment, and leadership. Among those captured during the chaotic retreat from Cyrenaica was a slight, soft-spoken man named Domenico Caiacetti, the youngest of 12 children born to a peasant family in the mountain village of Mona in the Dolomites of northern Italy. Caiacetti had dreamed of becoming an artist since childhood, spending his elementary school years sketching in the margins of his textbooks and begging his family for paints and brushes they could barely afford. When poverty prevented him from attending art school, he had apprenticed at 15 with a master painter in Orkney, learning the intricate techniques of decorating statues and churches that would serve him well in ways he could never have imagined. Called up for military service as tensions escalated across Europe, Caiacetti fought for 6 months in the furnace heat of the Libyan desert before Canadian forces captured him during one of the many British offensives that ground down Italian resistance. He carried with him a small prayer card given to him by his mother before he left home, an image of the Madonna and Child painted by Niccolò Berabino that would become the inspiration for one of the most moving artistic achievements to emerge from the Second World War. The journey from the North African prison camps to the Orkney Islands was a study in contrasts that illustrated the vast differences in how various nations treated their prisoners of war during the global conflict. While Caiacetti and his fellow Italians were transported in reasonable conditions aboard British ships, with adequate food, medical care, and adherence to the Geneva Convention, a parallel universe of suffering was unfolding across the Pacific theater where Japanese forces were implementing a prisoner of war system so brutal it defied comprehension. In Japanese camps stretching from the Philippines to Burma, Allied prisoners were dying at rates 7 times higher than those held in German camps, worked to death on projects like the Burma-Thailand Railway, where over 16,000 Allied prisoners of war perished out of the 60,000 forced to carve a 415-kilometer transportation link through dense jungle using nothing but hand tools, inadequate food, and non-existent medical care. The Japanese military philosophy held that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, and prisoners were treated accordingly, subjected to beatings, starvation, disease, and summary execution for the slightest infractions. When the war ended, investigations would reveal that of the approximately 350,000 Allied prisoners held by the Japanese, nearly 30% had died in captivity, compared to roughly 4% of those held by the Germans. The contrast becomes even starker when examining the technical projects that prisoners were forced to complete under different captor nations. Japanese prisoners of war were driven to construct railways through malarial swamps, mine precious metals in underground tunnels where cave-ins and explosions were routine, and labor in factories producing weapons that would be used against their own countrymen, all while subsisting on rations of rice and vegetables that provided fewer than 1,000 calories per day. Death was not just accepted but expected, with Japanese commanders calculating prisoner mortality rates into their construction timelines with the same cold efficiency they used to estimate concrete requirements or steel tonnage. Meanwhile, in camps across Britain and North America, German and Italian prisoners were generally housed in facilities that met international standards, fed adequate rations, provided with recreational activities, and even paid modest wages for their labor. The difference was not just humanitarian but reflected fundamentally different philosophies about the nature of warfare, the value of human life, and the obligations of civilized nations even toward their enemies. When the transport ship carrying Caiacetti and 549 other Italian prisoners reached the wind-battered harbor of Kirkwall in late January 1942, the men stepping onto Scottish soil encountered conditions that were harsh but fundamentally different from the death camps their Japanese-held contemporaries faced thousands of miles away. The Orkney Islands in winter present a landscape of stunning bleakness, where howling gales drive horizontal sheets of rain and sleet across treeless islands that seem to exist at the very edge of the habitable world. Temperatures hover just above freezing. The sun barely clears the horizon during the brief winter days, and the aurora borealis flickers green and blue across skies so dark they seem to swallow light itself. For men accustomed to the heat and bright sunshine of Mediterranean climates, Orkney in January must have felt like exile to an Arctic wasteland, yet the British treatment of these prisoners demonstrated a commitment to international law and basic human dignity that would have been incomprehensible to their contemporaries suffering under Japanese control. Camp 60 on Lamb Holm consisted of 13 prefabricated Nissen huts arranged around a central square, with additional facilities for administration, dining, and basic medical care. The prisoners were housed in barracks that, while Spartan, provided adequate shelter, heating, and sanitation, a far cry from the bamboo shacks and open-air compounds where Japanese-held prisoners endured monsoon rains, tropical diseases, and the constant threat of arbitrary punishment. The British established clear rules and routines, provided 3 meals a day that met nutritional requirements set by international agreements, and even allowed the formation of recreational activities including football matches, theatrical performances, and educational classes. Most importantly for the story that would unfold, the British commanders demonstrated a flexibility and humanity that permitted prisoners to pursue projects that served no military purpose but addressed fundamental human needs for meaning, beauty, and spiritual expression. The work assigned to the Italian prisoners was the construction of the Churchill Barriers, an engineering project of staggering scope and complexity that would permanently alter the geography of the Orkney Islands while creating a defensive system capable of withstanding any future submarine infiltration attempts. The 4 barriers would stretch a combined 2.3 kilometers across the channels separating Lamb Holm, Glimpse Holm, Bury, and South Ronaldsay from the Orkney mainland, creating permanent road connections between islands that had been isolated for centuries. The technical requirements were enormous. Foundations of broken rock weighing 250,000 tons had to be deposited in waters up to 18 meters deep using overhead cableways, then covered with 66,000 precisely cast concrete blocks arranged in patterns that would dissipate wave energy while supporting vehicle traffic. The logistics were equally daunting, requiring the construction of railways to transport materials, the establishment of concrete mixing plants capable of producing blocks weighing 5 and 10 tons each, and the development of specialized equipment to handle construction in the challenging marine environment where tidal currents, winter storms, and freezing temperatures created constant hazards. Initially, the Italian prisoners resisted the work assignments, arguing correctly that forcing prisoners of war to labor on military fortifications violated the Geneva Convention provisions that prohibited using captive personnel for projects that directly supported the war effort against their own country. The strike that followed demonstrated both the prisoners' understanding of international law and the British commitment to finding solutions that respected legal obligations while meeting military necessities. Rather than responding with force or punishment, British administrators successfully argued that the barriers were not military fortifications but improvements to communications that would benefit the civilian populations of the southern Orkney Islands by providing permanent road connections to replace the unreliable ferry services that had linked these remote communities for generations. This legal fiction satisfied international observers and allowed the project to continue, though it fooled no one about the barrier's primary purpose of sealing off the approaches to Scapa Flow. The work itself was backbreaking and dangerous, conducted in weather conditions that would challenge the most experienced construction crews. Italian prisoners, many of whom had never seen snow before their capture, learned to operate machinery in sub-zero temperatures, to work with concrete that threatened to freeze before it could be properly placed, and to maintain equipment that required constant attention to prevent mechanical failures in the harsh marine environment. They quarried stone from local sites, mixed concrete using materials transported hundreds of miles by rail and ship, and positioned massive blocks with cranes and cableways that swayed dangerously in the constant wind. Several British workers died during the construction, mostly from drowning when transport barges broke free in rough seas, or when the overhead cableway carrying workers across Kirk Sound plunged into the churning waters below, claiming 5 men who had hitched a ride in the bucket system. Yet even as the prisoners labored on this massive construction project, they began to transform their austere camp environment in ways that revealed the human capacity for creativity and beauty even under the most restrictive circumstances. Using leftover concrete from the barrier construction, the Italians poured pathways between their huts and created small recreational areas where they could gather during their limited free time. They planted flowers and vegetables in tiny gardens that brought color and life to the gray industrial landscape, demonstrated their craftsmanship by building a theater complete with painted scenery for performances that entertained both prisoners and British personnel, and even constructed 3 concrete billiard tables in a recreation hall that became the social center of camp life. These improvements went far beyond mere utilitarian necessities and reflected a determination to maintain dignity and cultural identity even in captivity. The prisoners also developed an informal economy based on handicrafts created from scrap materials salvaged from the construction project and the detritus of military life. Using skills learned in civilian occupations, they fashioned jewelry from discarded metal, carved toys from scraps of wood, and created decorative objects that they traded with guards or gave as gifts to local families who gradually overcame their initial suspicion of these foreign prisoners. Arcadian families still treasure POW-made artifacts passed down through generations, tangible reminders of an unexpected chapter in their island's history when the exigencies of war brought Italian artisans to work alongside Scottish laborers on a project that would outlast the conflict that created it. The quality of these improvised creations astonished their British captors and began to change perceptions about the character and capabilities of the men they were guarding. Among the prisoners, Domenico Chiacetti quickly distinguished himself not only for his artistic talents, but for his ability to inspire and organize collaborative projects that united men from different regions of Italy who might have had little in common beyond their current circumstances. Drawing on his training in decorative arts, Chiacetti created a statue of St. George slaying the dragon for the camp's central square, fashioning the figure from barbed wire covered with concrete and painted with pigments mixed from whatever materials he could scavenge. Completed on August 7, 1943, the statue bore an inscription reading, PDG, Italiano, Li 7-8-1943, where PDG stood for Prigioniero di Guerra, Italian for prisoner of war, a proud declaration of identity even in captivity. The statue served not only as artistic expression but as a symbol of resistance against the demoralization that could easily have overwhelmed men separated from their families and homelands for years with no certain prospect of return. The transformation of Camp 60 from a utilitarian detention facility into something approaching a community reached its culmination in 1943 when Major Buckland, the camp commandant, and Father Gioacchino Giacobazzi, the Italian priest who served the spiritual needs of the Catholic prisoners, agreed that the men needed a proper place of worship. The decision reflected both practical considerations about maintaining morale and discipline among long-term prisoners and a genuine recognition of the fundamental human need for spiritual expression and communal gathering. 2 surplus Nissen huts were designated for conversion into a chapel, with the understanding that all work would be conducted during the prisoners' free time using materials that would not interfere with the barrier construction project. What began as a simple administrative decision to provide religious services would evolve into one of the most extraordinary artistic achievements to emerge from the Second World War. Caicetti approached the chapel project with the same meticulous planning and collaborative spirit that had characterized his earlier artistic efforts, but with an ambition and vision that surprised even his most supportive admirers. Working with a team of skilled craftsmen that included Giuseppe Palumbi, a blacksmith whose metalworking expertise would prove essential, and Domenico Buttapasta, a cement worker whose knowledge of concrete construction enabled structural modifications that seemed impossible given the limited resources available. Caicetti developed plans for transforming the crude corrugated steel huts into a space that would rival the churches of their homeland. The project would require not just artistic skill but engineering ingenuity, as the basic Nissen hut design provided no precedent for the Gothic arches, decorated walls, and ornate furnishings that Caicetti envisioned. The first challenge was concealing the industrial ugliness of the corrugated steel walls and curved roof that gave Nissen huts their characteristic utilitarian appearance. Using plasterboard scrounged from construction sites and storage areas, the prisoners covered the interior surfaces to create a foundation for painted decoration that would transform the space completely. The plasterboard itself had to be carefully measured, cut, and fitted using hand tools and improvised techniques, as the prisoners had no access to the specialized equipment normally used for such work. Every sheet had to be secured with nails and fasteners salvaged from other projects, creating a patchwork covering that required constant repair and adjustment as the building settled and shifted with temperature changes. With the basic surface prepared, Caicetti began the painstaking work of painting an interior that would convince visitors they had entered a stone church rather than a converted military hut. Using brushes donated by a sympathetic local artist and paints acquired through the generosity of Balfour Beatty personnel who had come to respect the prisoners' artistic ambitions, he created the illusion of carved stone walls, vaulted ceilings supported by Gothic columns, and architectural details that demonstrated not only technical skill but profound knowledge of ecclesiastical design traditions. The painted walls featured trompe-l'oeil stonework so convincing that visitors instinctively reached out to touch surfaces that appeared to be carved granite, but were actually plaster and paint applied with techniques learned in the workshops of northern Italy. The altar became the focal point of Caicetti's artistic vision, both structurally and spiritually. Constructed from concrete left over from the barrier project, the altar was shaped and finished to resemble carved stone, with details that demonstrated the prisoner's ability to transform the most utilitarian materials into objects of beauty and reverence. Behind the altar, Caicetti painted his masterpiece, a depiction of the Madonna and Child based on the prayer card his mother had given him before he left Italy. The image of the Madonna of the Olives by Niccolò Berabino became the inspiration for a painting that captured not only the artistic traditions of Catholic devotional art, but the particular yearning of men separated from home and family by circumstances beyond their control. Working by lamplight during the long winter evenings, Caicetti applied layer after layer of paint to achieve the luminous quality that would make the Madonna's face seem to glow with compassion and understanding. The collaborative nature of the chapel project demonstrated the extraordinary range of skills represented among the Italian prisoners and their ability to organize complex undertakings despite the restrictions of camp life. Giuseppe Palumbi, the blacksmith, created an intricate wrought iron rood screen that separated the sanctuary from the nave, fashioning the metalwork from scraps of steel and iron collected from the construction sites and heated in a forge improvised from materials available in the camp. His work included not only the decorative screen but altar rails, candlesticks, and light fixtures that transformed utilitarian metal into objects of ecclesiastical beauty. Primavera and Micheloni, both electricians in civilian life, installed a lighting system that used bulbs and wiring acquired through official channels and creative improvisation, creating illumination that enhanced the painted decorations and provided the warm, reverent atmosphere essential for worship. The prisoners' ingenuity in acquiring and repurposing materials became legendary among the British personnel who watched the chapel take shape. Wood for the tabernacle came from a shipwreck that washed ashore during one of the violent storms that regularly battered the islands, providing seasoned timber that the prisoners carefully selected, cleaned, and shaped into the receptacle for the Eucharist. Light holders were fashioned from empty corned beef tins, their original labels carefully removed and surfaces polished until they resembled proper ecclesiastical metalwork. The baptismal font's base was actually a suspension spring from a military vehicle, coated with concrete and shaped into a decorative spiral that appeared to be carved stone. These transformations required not only technical skill but an artistic vision that could see beauty and potential in the most unpromising materials. As work on the interior continued, the prisoners turned their attention to the chapel's exterior, determined to create a facade that would announce the building's sacred purpose to anyone approaching Camp 60. Budapesta led the construction of an ornate front entrance featuring Gothic pillars, decorative pinnacles, an arched doorway, and a bell tower that completely concealed the utilitarian Nissen hut design. Above the entrance, Panisi, another skilled craftsman among the prisoners, sculpted a head of Christ from red clay, complete with a crown of thorns that demonstrated both artistic ability and deep religious feeling. The entire exterior was then covered with a thick layer of concrete that not only protected the underlying structure from Orkney's harsh weather, but created a unified appearance that made the building appear to be constructed from stone rather than assembled from prefabricated metal components. The chapel project progressed through 1943 and into 1944 as the war situation evolved dramatically for Italy and its prisoners of war. When the Italian government capitulated to the Allies in September 1943, the status of the prisoners changed from enemy captives to co-belligerents, though many chose to remain in Orkney rather than return to a homeland torn by civil war and German occupation. Those who stayed were now paid for their labor and given greater freedom of movement, though many had formed such strong attachments to their artistic project and to the Scottish community that had gradually accepted them that departure held little appeal. The change in status also meant that work on the chapel could continue without concerns about international law, as the prisoners were now volunteers rather than captives compelled to labor. By early 1944, as work on the Churchill Barriers neared completion, the chapel had become not just a place of worship but a symbol of cultural exchange and human resilience that attracted attention from throughout the British Isles. Visitors to Camp 60 were invariably astonished by the transformation that had occurred within the humble Nissen huts, finding themselves in a space that rivaled the churches of Italy for beauty and spiritual atmosphere. The painted walls created an illusion of vast Gothic architecture that seemed impossible within the confines of the original buildings, while the altar and furnishings demonstrated craftsmanship that transcended the circumstances of their creation. British officers who had initially viewed the prisoners as a necessary burden began to speak of them with genuine respect and admiration, recognizing artistic achievements that would have been remarkable under any circumstances but seemed miraculous given the limitations imposed by wartime conditions and prison camp regulations. The chapel's completion coincided with the end of the prisoners' work on the Churchill Barriers, as the massive concrete causeways were finally ready to serve their purpose of protecting Scapa Flow from future submarine infiltration. The barriers represented one of the largest engineering projects completed in Scotland during the war years, involving the precise placement of 66,000 concrete blocks and the creation of permanent road connections that would transform the geography and economy of the southern Orkney Islands for generations to come. The technical achievement was impressive by any standard, but the human story of Italian prisoners creating beauty amid the machinery of war provided a counterpoint to the utilitarian purpose of the construction project. On September 9, 1944, as the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, most of the Italian prisoners boarded transport ships for the journey south to camps in Yorkshire where they would work on agricultural projects before eventual repatriation to Italy. The departure was emotional for both prisoners and the British personnel who had come to know them as individuals rather than simply as enemy captives. Arcadian families who had befriended the Italians gathered to bid farewell to men who had become part of their community, despite the circumstances that had brought them together. Children who had received handmade toys from prisoner craftsmen waved goodbye to the foreign soldiers who had somehow become familiar figures in their remote island world. Chiachetti remained behind for 2 additional weeks to complete work on the Holy Water Stoop, a final detail that demonstrated his perfectionist approach to the chapel project and his reluctance to leave his masterpiece unfinished. Working alone in the empty camp as his fellow prisoners traveled toward uncertain futures in a Europe still torn by war, Chiachetti applied final touches to the painted decorations and made adjustments to the lighting and furnishings that would ensure the chapel's preservation for whatever future awaited it. His solitary vigil in the nearly deserted camp represented both an artistic dedication that placed the work above personal considerations and a spiritual commitment to completing something that had become larger than any individual contribution. When Chiachetti finally departed Orkney in February 1946, after 6 years and 8 months away from home, he left behind more than just a remarkable artistic achievement. The chapel had become a bridge between cultures that had been divided by war, demonstrating the universal human capacity for creativity, faith, and transcendence even under the most difficult circumstances. The building itself would survive the demolition of the rest of Camp 60, preserved by local residents who recognized its unique value and were determined to maintain it as a memorial to an extraordinary chapter in their island's history. More importantly, Chiachetti and his fellow prisoners had established personal relationships with Scottish families that would endure long after the political conflicts that had brought them together were resolved. The contrast with the fate of prisoners in other theaters of the war remained stark and sobering. While Chiachetti was creating art that would inspire generations of visitors to a remote Scottish island, Allied prisoners in Japanese camps were dying by the thousands in conditions that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The Burma-Thailand Railway alone claimed over 16,000 Allied lives, with prisoners worked to death on construction projects that made the Churchill Barriers seem like a humanitarian enterprise by comparison. Japanese camps provided minimal food, no medical care, and summary execution for prisoners who could no longer work, creating mortality rates that shocked investigators after the war. The difference was not just in treatment but in fundamental philosophy. While British and American forces generally viewed prisoners as temporary enemies who retained basic human rights, Japanese military culture regarded surrender as such a fundamental dishonor that those who submitted rather than fighting to the death forfeited any claim to decent treatment. Technical projects undertaken by prisoners in Japanese camps demonstrated this philosophical difference in stark terms. Allied prisoners forced to work on the Burma Railway were given hand tools to carve roadbeds through dense jungle, working in monsoon conditions that turned construction sites into malarial swamps, where disease was as deadly as exhaustion or starvation. The Japanese calculated that completing the railway in the shortest possible time justified any number of prisoner deaths, treating human life as just another expendable resource to be consumed in pursuit of military objectives. Prisoners who collapsed from exhaustion or disease were often beaten or executed, rather than provided with medical care, while those who survived long enough to complete assigned tasks were simply transferred to other equally deadly projects. The industrial use of prisoner labor in Japanese-occupied territories extended far beyond railway construction to mining operations, factory production, and dock construction that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives while providing significant support to the Japanese war economy. Prisoners were forced to mine precious metals in underground tunnels where cave-ins and explosions were routine hazards, to work in munitions factories producing weapons that would be used against their own countrymen, and to construct harbor facilities and airfields that directly supported Japanese military operations. The work was deliberately punitive as well as productive, designed to break the spirit of prisoners who had committed the ultimate dishonor of surrender while extracting maximum economic value from their labor before they died of disease, exhaustion, or deliberate execution. The psychological dimension of prisoner treatment revealed equally stark contrasts between Japanese practices and the experience of Italian prisoners in Orkney. While Chiachetti and his fellow prisoners were encouraged to pursue artistic projects that served no military purpose but addressed fundamental human needs for meaning and creative expression, Allied prisoners in Japanese camps were systematically deprived of anything that might maintain morale or group cohesion. Books, musical instruments, and art supplies were forbidden, while religious services were prohibited or severely restricted. Prisoners were deliberately separated from friends and comrades, assigned numbers rather than being addressed by name, and subjected to psychological techniques designed to destroy individual identity and group solidarity. The Japanese approach reflected not only different military philosophies but fundamentally different concepts of human nature and the obligations of civilized societies even toward enemies. While British and American forces generally attempted to maintain prisoner dignity while extracting useful labor, Japanese camps operated on the principle that surrender had stripped prisoners of their humanity and reduced them to the status of military resources to be exploited without regard for survival or suffering. The result was a prisoner experience so brutal that post-war investigations documented survival rates and treatment standards that shocked even hardened military personnel accustomed to the harsh realities of modern warfare. Meanwhile, in the years following the departure of the Italian prisoners, the chapel they had created on Lamb Holm began to attract visitors who came to see what local residents had begun calling the miracle of Camp 60. Word of the remarkable transformation spread through networks of military personnel, clergy, and journalists who carried the story to audiences throughout Britain and beyond. The building itself began to deteriorate as rain seeped through the roof and wind battered the exterior concrete, threatening the painted decorations that had required years of patient work to complete. By 1958, the chapel was in such poor condition that local residents organized the Chapel Preservation Committee to coordinate restoration efforts and ensure the building's survival for future generations. The BBC, learning of the preservation efforts, launched a radio appeal asking if any listeners knew the whereabouts of the Italian prisoners who had created the chapel, particularly Domenico Caiacetti, whose artistic vision had been central to the project. In the entire United Kingdom, only one couple had maintained contact with Caiacetti, having befriended him during his brief stay at a camp in Yorkshire before repatriation. Their information enabled the BBC to contact local authorities in Mona, who arranged for Caiacetti to receive a telephone call from England explaining the chapel's deteriorating condition and the desire to bring him back to Orkney for restoration work. The call came as a complete surprise to Caiacetti, who had assumed that his chapel would have been demolished along with the rest of Camp 60 and had resigned himself to the loss of his greatest artistic achievement. In March 1960, 18 years after his first arrival in Orkney as a prisoner of war, Caiacetti returned to Lamb Holm as an honored guest, flown to Scotland at BBC expense and welcomed by islanders who had preserved his work through their own efforts and determination. The reunion was emotional for everyone involved, as the artist who had created beauty from the scraps of war returned to find his masterpiece still inspiring visitors from around the world. Working with local craftsmen who had volunteered their time and expertise, Caiacetti spent 3 weeks restoring the painted decorations, repairing structural damage, and making improvements that would help preserve the chapel for future generations. The restoration work was covered extensively by British media, introducing the story to audiences who had never heard of the Italian chapel and establishing it as one of the most moving symbols of reconciliation to emerge from the Second World War. During his restoration visit, Caiacetti was invited to attend a special service in the chapel, conducted by clergy from multiple denominations who recognized the building's significance as a place of worship that transcended sectarian boundaries. The first person to receive communion during the service was Caiacetti himself, kneeling at the altar he had created from leftover concrete, while surrounded by British residents who had maintained his artistic legacy through years of careful stewardship. The moment represented not just the completion of an artistic project but the healing of wounds that had divided nations and individuals during the global conflict, demonstrating the power of human creativity to bridge differences that seemed insurmountable during wartime. Caiacetti's letter to the people of Orkney, written before his departure in April 1960, captured the emotional significance of his return visit and the enduring bonds that had been created between former enemies who had discovered their common humanity during the darkest period of the 20th century. "The chapel is yours," he wrote, "for you to love and preserve. I take with me to Italy the remembrance of your kindness and wonderful hospitality. I thank the authorities of Kirkwall, the Courteous Preservation Committee, and all those who directly or indirectly have collaborated for the success of this work, and for having given me the joy of seeing again the little chapel of Lamb Holm where I, in leaving, leave a part of my heart." The relationships established during the war and strengthened during Caiacetti's return visit evolved into lasting friendships between the communities of Orkney and Mona that continue to the present day. In 1964, Caiacetti returned to Scotland with his wife Maria, allowing her to see the chapel that had occupied so much of her husband's thoughts and conversation during the years since his repatriation. Their visit was celebrated throughout the islands as residents who remembered the Italian prisoners welcomed the couple with a warmth that demonstrated how completely the wartime divisions had been healed. In 1970, Caiacetti made his final visit to Orkney, accompanied by his children Fabio and Letizia, passing on to the next generation the connections that had grown from his artistic work during the war years. The ongoing relationship between Orkney and Mona has included student exchanges, cultural programs, and regular visits by former prisoners and their families who maintain personal relationships established decades earlier. In 1992, 8 former prisoners returned to Orkney to commemorate the 50th anniversary of their arrival, finding themselves welcomed as honored guests rather than former enemies. The visit was documented by BBC Television, which produced a program called The Miracle of Camp 60, that introduced the story to new audiences and reinforced the chapel's status as a symbol of human resilience and the possibility of reconciliation even after the most bitter conflicts. In 1996, officials from Orkney and Mona signed a formal declaration of friendship that recognized the enduring bonds created by the chapel project and established frameworks for continuing cultural exchange between the two communities. The declaration acknowledged that what had begun as a military necessity during wartime had evolved into something far more significant, a demonstration that human creativity and compassion could flourish even under the most restrictive circumstances, and that the connections formed during those extraordinary years had permanent value that transcended the political conflicts that had originally brought the communities together. Today, the Italian chapel receives over 100,000 visitors annually, making it one of Orkney's most popular tourist attractions and one of the most visited religious sites in Scotland. The building has been designated a Category A listed structure, recognizing its national importance and ensuring its preservation for future generations. Regular services are still held in the chapel during the summer months, welcoming worshippers from around the world who come to experience the spiritual atmosphere created by prisoners of war who transformed their captivity into an opportunity for artistic and religious expression. The chapel's influence has extended far beyond Orkney, inspiring books, documentaries, academic studies, and artistic works that examine the complex relationships between captivity and creativity, war and reconciliation, individual artistic vision, and collective cultural exchange. The building serves as a case study for historians exploring the treatment of prisoners of war during the Second World War, while art historians examine Caicetti's techniques and the ways in which traditional ecclesiastical design was adapted to the constraints imposed by limited materials and prison camp conditions. For military historians, the chapel project provides insight into the British approach to prisoner management during the war years, demonstrating how policies that respected international law and human dignity could produce positive outcomes even under challenging circumstances. The contrast with Japanese prisoner camps remains particularly striking, as the dramatically different outcomes reflected fundamentally different philosophies about the nature of warfare, the treatment of enemies, and the obligations of civilized societies even during periods of existential conflict. The technical achievement represented by the Churchill Barriers continues to serve its original purpose more than 80 years after construction began, protecting Scapa Flow from underwater intrusion while providing essential transportation links between the southern Orkney Islands. The barriers have withstood decades of North Atlantic storms, demonstrating the engineering excellence that characterized the project and the quality of work performed by British construction crews and Italian prisoners working together under extraordinarily difficult conditions. Modern visitors driving across the barriers can see the rusted remains of blockships that provided the original protection for Scapa Flow, tangible reminders of the naval disasters that prompted the construction project and the strategic importance of the anchorage for British naval operations throughout both world wars. The human dimension of the barrier construction project, exemplified by the chapel but extending to all aspects of the cultural exchange between Italian prisoners and Scottish residents, provides a counterpoint to the massive engineering achievement and the strategic military objectives that drove the original construction. The friendships formed between prisoners and guards, the artistic collaborations that produced not only the chapel but dozens of smaller works of art and craftsmanship, and the economic relationships that developed as prisoners created goods for trade with local families all demonstrate the capacity for human connection even under the artificial divisions imposed by military conflict. The legacy of the Italian prisoners in Orkney has become part of the island's cultural identity, with local families still treasuring prisoner-made artifacts passed down through generations and maintaining connections with Italian families that stretch back to the war years. These relationships have produced ongoing cultural exchanges, educational programs, and artistic collaborations that continue to evolve as new generations discover the remarkable story of the prisoners who built beauty from the scraps of war. The chapel itself has become a pilgrimage destination for visitors seeking spiritual inspiration and historical understanding, a place where the brutalities of modern warfare are balanced by evidence of human creativity and the persistent possibility of redemption even under the most difficult circumstances. In the broader context of Second World War history, the story of the Italian chapel serves as a reminder that individual choices and actions can create positive outcomes even within systems designed for conflict and destruction. Chiacchetti's decision to pursue artistic excellence rather than merely completing a functional religious space, Major Buckland's willingness to support projects that served no military purpose, and the determination of Scottish residents to preserve and maintain the chapel all represent choices to prioritize human values over expedient solutions or bureaucratic convenience. The contrast with the systematic brutality that characterized prisoner treatment in other theaters of the war serves not to diminish the significance of what happened in Orkney, but to highlight the importance of maintaining civilized standards even during periods of total war. The survival rates, working conditions, and creative opportunities provided to Italian prisoners in British camps stand as testament to the possibility of conducting military operations according to international law and humanitarian principles, even when facing enemies who showed no such restraint in their own treatment of prisoners. As visitors stand today in the Italian chapel on Lamb Holm, surrounded by painted walls that transform corrugated steel into Gothic stone and contemplating an altar created from the same concrete used to build defensive barriers against submarine attack, they witness the enduring power of human creativity to transcend the circumstances of its creation. The chapel serves as physical evidence that beauty can emerge from conflict, that enemies can become friends, and that the worst impulses of human nature represented by total war can be balanced by the best impulses represented by artistic creation and cultural exchange. The men who built this sacred space from tin cans and concrete scraps accomplished something that transcends military history or art history or even religious history, creating a symbol of human possibility that continues to inspire visitors more than 8 decades after the last Italian prisoner departed Orkney for home. Their achievement reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, when nations commit their entire resources to destroying each other and civilians become legitimate targets for total war, individual human beings retain the capacity to choose beauty over ugliness, creation over destruction, and reconciliation over perpetual conflict. In this small chapel on a wind-swept Scottish island, created by prisoners of war who could have chosen despair and maintained by local residents who could have chosen forgetting, the human spirit achieved one of its most complete victories over the forces that would reduce human beings to numbers in military calculations or statistics in casualty reports. The Italian chapel stands not as a monument to war but as evidence of the possibility that transcends war, a reminder that even in humanity's worst moments, the best of human nature endures and ultimately prevails through the simple but revolutionary act of creating beauty where none existed before.